Hi again, everybody. This is a real quick tour through a little concept called the New South. Now, the New South is kind of like General Motors' advertising strategy about every 20 years, where the GM will build some really terrible cars and everybody makes fun of them, and then GM will have an ad campaign where they say, "We've changed. We know our cars have had quality defects in the past, but this is the new General Motors. We're much better now, and you can rely on our automobiles." And then they release a bunch of terrible automobiles. And then 20 years later, they have another ad campaign where it's, "We're General Motors and we've changed. We know our quality reputation has been a little checkered in the past, but this is the new General Motors." And then they release some bad vehicles, and you get the picture. Same things happen with the American South, where they rebrand themselves as the New South about every 50 years. So at this point, after Reconstruction, we're getting to the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and the South realizes it needs to rebrand itself after the Civil War. So what's happening down there? Well, the Southern economy is stuck in limbo. Rural planters, whom we used to call plantation owners, who are now calling themselves planters, they're basically trying to bring back the 1840s or the 1240s or the 1440s. Who can tell, because these morons are stuck in the feudal age. They're still attempting to live as if slavery is a thing, as if they are kings living in a castle and having their peons do the work for them. These idiots won't learn. So the new shtick, instead of slaves, is sharecroppers, which we've talked about already in class. A sharecropper is a person who rents the land with the idea that someday they'll own it, and they get to keep a share of their crop that they can then sell for profit. But that's never going to happen because the planter is the only person they can buy seeds from, supplies from, etc., and they keep them poor and broke, etc., etc., etc. Now, what starts happening is that other white Southerners who are not stuck in the sharecropping system, but not wealthy enough to be planters, start realizing, say fellas, rest of the country got roads. We ain't got no roads, fellas. Fellas, y'all remember in the war when them Northerners had, like, metal? We ain't got no place making no metal. Hey, fellas, you remember when they had all them war wagons? We ain't got no factories making wagons. Other white Southerners start realizing, our part of the country is an anachronistic joke. We don't have any factories. We don't have any industry. We don't have an economy. We've still got the same rich guys from 1607 doing the same crap they've been doing since then, that their ancestors have been doing since the 1200s, and we're broke, and we're left behind, and this is never going to get better. So some white Southerners start pushing the idea of the New South, much like we're the new General Motors. So the editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is still a huge newspaper in Atlanta, Georgia, really influential newspaper, the Atlanta newspaper editorial runs a call for a new Southern economy based on manufacturing and commerce. That the South has to build a manufacturing base. We need factories. We need shipyards. We need roads. We need all of the things you need for a, at the time, modern economy. And they try, and it starts to work in some places. Birmingham, Alabama becomes known as a steel town. Now, give you a little bit of history, especially for those of you who live in Birmingham, Toledo. Back in England, Birmingham, England was the big iron manufacturing town in central England. So in the United States, you'll find that lots of places named Birmingham are also places that became iron and steel towns. And Birmingham, Alabama is one of those places. Birmingham, Toledo is settled in the 1870s, 1880s by an iron company. And they bring in a bunch of Czechoslovakian and Hungarian workers. And that's the birth of the iron and steel industry in Toledo, which still exists in a very large part to this day. And it started in the neighborhood named Birmingham. And you'll find that in almost any place in the United States. With the name of Birmingham, it comes back to being an iron or a steel town. So Birmingham, Alabama really does become a great iron and steel town, to the fact where Birmingham hosted a college football bowl game every year called the Iron Bowl. It became part of their identity. Durham, North Carolina became the cigarette rolling capital of America. All along the Appalachian foothills, you had lots of places start up as big textile mills, and a lot of them specialized in carpet. And you'll find today that if you're buying carpet that was made in the United States, a lot of it is made in Appalachia, from these mills that are descendant from the mills started during the New South movement. There were also shipyards in places like Gulfport, Mississippi, Pascagoula, Alabama, New Orleans, Louisiana, shipyards that started getting formed and stuff. And Galveston, Texas is another one. And then you also see cities of commerce start coming together. So the places we think of as big cities in the South today, like Atlanta, like Houston, New Orleans, Raleigh-Durham, Charlotte, a lot of those towns start becoming centers of commerce. They start having banks headquartered there. They start kind of trying to mimic the things the North is doing. Does it happen successfully? Not everywhere. Does it happen on large scale? Not at all. But the New South movement does start to take off a little bit. Now, what's holding it back? The one thing Southerners are not willing to deal with: racism. And so you see here in this artist's depiction, here you've got the factory, the textile factory in the background, which if you try and just imagine this picture from this line up, it's going to look like anything in the North at the turn of the century. When you look from this line down, it looks like America from 1619 to the present, because racism is still the thing holding the South back. It's not just your economy. It's this entire way that you've organized your society. And this depiction, I think, just does a marvelous job of showing that you've got this, 17th century scene at the front and a 20th century scene at the back. They cannot get their crap together down there. That racism leads to new old things, and that is racism wrapped up in a brand new name. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 is a Supreme Court decision that almost all of you have heard of. Plessy is the case that begins legalized segregation throughout the United States. It involves a man named Homer Plessy in New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans had a group of citizens, white and black, who had come together saying, we got to get past racism in this town. And one of the things that they tried to do was to challenge laws that required black people to sit on a certain part of a train or not. Homer Plessy, who was exceptionally light-skinned, was picked as the test subject. He was 1/8 African American, and therefore by law, he was what was called an octoroon, and legally black, even though he had passed as white most of his life. He sits in the white part of the train, as he had done before, and tells someone, I am in fact black. At that point, Homer Plessy is committing a crime. He gets in trouble. He then sues on this railroad in New Orleans, saying, look, I sat in these places the whole time. I've passed as white my whole life. The fact that I have been able to do this shows how ridiculous and stupid your law is. And instead, this gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, no. And in probably their second worst decision behind Dred Scott versus Sanford, the Supreme Court allows what we call separate but equal segregation. They said states are allowed to make rules separating the races, but under the 14th Amendment in equal protection, everybody is allowed access to whatever it is. So, as you see here, if there is a white drinking fountain, there must be a drinking fountain for African American people. If there's a white bathroom, there's a black bathroom. If there's a place for white people to eat at the restaurant, there has to be a separate place for black people. Black theaters, white theaters, etc., etc., etc. Black schools, white schools. Black hospitals, white hospitals. All kept separate, but they have to exist. Now, by equal, you guys can just tell by this picture. One of these is a super fancy water fountain that's got the chiller in the bottom and stuff, so you're going to get nice cool water. The other is basically tap water run out through a little porcelain bowl. Equal didn't mean they had to be the same. It just meant there had to be kind of the same thing. And that, of course, is one of many major problems with separate but equal, which we'll talk about more later when we talk about the fall of Jim Crow and the civil rights movement as it picks up in the 30s and 40s. They're going to start targeting these little things like this. Plessy v. Ferguson and this new segregation era, they begin a new era in the South that looks a whole lot like the old era in the South. And we call this the Jim Crow era. Now, Jim Crow was a character in minstrel shows. Minstrel shows were shows where a white actor would put on black makeup and go in blackface, which, please allow me to tell you right now, if you didn't know blackface was wrong already, you do now. Don't do it. But white actors would put on black makeup to pretend they were black and give shows that had just like the grossest stereotypically biased stuff you've ever seen, with really exaggerated language and so on and so forth. And so Jim Crow is a character. And I've told students in the past, Jim Crow is kind of a character like Batman, right? Like, lots of people have played Batman. Batman shows up in lots of things. Batman is a character everywhere. Or Santa Claus is a character that's all over the place. And lots of movies have Santa in them, and lots of plays, and lots of songs. But it's not like Santa is one character like, I don't know, James Bond, okay? Jim Crow is kind of this universal character that shows up in lots of different media at the time. And everybody kind of knows who Jim Crow is. If you'd said to somebody at the time, this is Jim Crow, they'd be like, oh yeah, I know that character. So they call these the Jim Crow laws because they are based on the stereotypes white people had of African American people. And they are laws intended to discriminate, disenfranchise, and force separation. All over the South, these laws discriminate against people. They reinforce, you are lower than this person over here. They disenfranchise people, which means keeps them from voting. They separate people, again, to reinforce mentally the inferior status of one group of people under another. It basically, if you set out today and you were like, how can I write laws to make white supremacy the law? You would do this, okay? This is exactly what you would do. It's not like the Jim Crow laws accidentally maintained white supremacy. They were intended to reinforce white supremacy, using the legal system to put white people above black people. Fighting back is where this gets interesting, and it is also, unfortunately, where we are going to end today. Fighting back starts almost immediately. And I know in the historical scheme of things, 10 years to you guys seems like a lifetime. 10 years is really the blink of an eye. Less than 10 years after, about 10 years, 15 years after Brown v. Board, after Plessy versus Ferguson, a group called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is formed, the NAACP. Now, please, make sure you know what NAACP stands for, because one of my favorite things to throw on a test as an extra credit question is, what does the NAACP stand for? And I put that question on because the answers I get are wild most of the time. Like the, National African American Committee for Protection and stuff like that. People make up some fabulous things to fit those letters. It is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Do not forget that, please. It is founded in large part by this man here, W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is an incredible character in Black history. And if you ever get the chance to read about Du Bois, his is an American story. And to be American is to understand a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois and where he was coming from. He begins with the NAACP, the legal system fight against segregation. The NAACP, to me, is the great heroic organization of the movement. Because what they understood was that this is not going to happen slowly. If it's going to happen and stick, it's not going to happen slowly. I am having a real hard time thinking today. It's not going to happen suddenly. It's not going to happen all at once. And it's not going to be dramatic. It's going to be a long series of gradual fights where a system that is, at this point, 400 years old, you're not going to bring it down with one swing of the axe. You're going to chop and chop and chop, and eventually you're going to chop far enough that that tree is just going to tumble over. And that's what the NAACP did. They tried to just keep chopping wood. They didn't take one big swing and then go, well, that didn't work. They knew we're going to be chopping for decades. So this is the big deal. It's a slow, steady, laborious process of beating the system with the system. We're going to walk away from this story for a little while, and we're going to come back to it again in a big way in Unit 7. So thanks for sticking with me. As always, be well.